Okay, welcome everyone. We're going to start the shir in another 30 seconds. I just wanted to in case anybody didn't understand how the questions work, if you're logged in through your computer or through an iPod, iPhone, you can chat. You can use the chat on the software to send in a question. You can send it so that everyone can see it. You can send it just to me. You can also change your username to make you anonymous. If you're calling in, we'll open it up after Yossi finishes speaking. We will open it up to questions, and I'll unmute everybody. But for the duration of Yossi's part, I'm going to keep everybody muted. So we'll go ahead. Yossi, I'll hand it to you, and go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. So we're getting close to Pesach. So the truth is that when all the dust settles, with all the matzah and the myrrh, and all the 50 million haggadahs that everyone has, and the different varts that everyone's preparing, and all that, what Pesach is about is emunah. That's what Pesach is about. It's about believing that Hashem loved Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. It's believing that Hashem loved us. He took us out of Mitzrayim, and He continues to take care of us this day. That's basically what Pesach is about, and it gets lost sometimes in the details. But that's what Pesach is about. So I figured that what I want to talk about today is a topic which I think it's somewhat independent, but truth is it also brings together everything we've been talking about over really since the beginning. The topic is the concept of the Yud Gimel Ikrim, the 13 principles of faith. Just a little bit of background of what I'm talking about. The Rambam invented a concept. The Rambam created a concept. He wrote about this in his commentary on the Mishnayos of Sanhedrin. The Rambam created this following idea, which is that all of Yiddishkeit can be boiled down to 13 principles. That's what he says. There are 13 principles of faith, and these are the Yud Gimel Ikrim. These are the 13 principles that every Jew has to officially, sign that they agree. You know what I mean? They're official to be participant in Yiddishkeit. You have to agree to these 13 principles of faith. And if you don't agree to any of these 13 principles, you are officially labeled a heretic and apikoros, and chas v'shalom. And that's what Yiddishkeit is. Yiddishkeit boils down to these 13 principles. Now, what was controversial about that was not so much each principle. Everyone agrees that each principle was true and accurate 100%. Everyone agrees to every concept the Rambam said. What was controversial and difficult for many Rishonim to swallow was, first of all, why are you doing this, Rambam? Why? What's your motivation? Why are you interested in boiling Yiddishkeit down to 13 points, as if to say these are more important than others? We believe in every pasuk in Chumash. Every pasuk in Chumash is coming from Hashem. It's something that we all have to believe in as being true. Every word of Gemara is true, and so on. So what's the big deal about these 13 principles? First of all, what's your motivation? And second of all, what does it mean, B'chalal, that these are 13 principles, fundamentals of Yiddishkeit? Everything in Yiddishkeit is important. That's the first major question. And because of that, many Rishonim disagree with the whole thing. They threw away this whole idea. The whole idea of the 13 principles of faith. There's such a concept like that. It was not found in Chazal. It doesn't have any hint to in Chazal in any place, as far as I understand. So they completely disagree with it. The Abarbanel and others didn't. They rejected the entire concept. Again, they didn't reject the principles themselves, but the concept of making principles. Another problem that other Rishonim saw with the Rambam is that anybody that's familiar a little bit with the Rambam's writing, especially in Mishnah Torah, is how careful the Rambam is not to repeat himself. The Rambam never repeats himself. If he says something, you have to remember what he says, and that's it. He's not going to repeat it. If a person looks at the 13 principles of faith, let's say in a Siddur in the Ani Mamins, which the Rambam didn't write that, but those are based on his 13 principles. There's a problem that many raise, which is that a lot of them seem to be repetitive. If you want to be more meticulous and boil it down even further, the Sefer HaIkrim, for example, one of the early Rishonim, he agreed with the concept of making principles of Yiddishkeit, but however, he said that if you want to really do it well, you could boil it down to just 3. There's a God, He communicates with us, and there's such a thing as reward and punishment. That's basically what it's all coming from. And even the 13 principles of the Rambam can be boiled down even further. So the questions that we have to deal with, and we're going to try to deal with, as succinctly as possible, is that what was the motivation b'chalal? What's the purpose of making 13 principles of faith? And second of all, if you're going to make those principles, then boil it down to as limited a number as you possibly can. Why make it 13 if you could boil it down even further? So the truth is like this: if a person studies the Mar Nevuchim, the Guide to the Perplexed, and generally just has a feeling of where the Rambam's worldview is coming from and what it means Judaism a philosophy-based Judaism, it becomes very clear what the purpose of these 13 principles of faith are. And as we'll see over the next few minutes, hopefully, we'll see very clearly how the Mekubalim, by the perspective of Kabbalah, doesn't see a necessity in having these 13 principles. And generally speaking, the Mekubalim do not make a big deal with the 13 principles of faith of the Rambam. There's a tefillah that some people say in the beginning of davening, Yigdal. So Yigdal is basically a shir, it's a song, it's a poem that's based on the 13 principles of faith. And it's well known that the Arizal was not a fan of saying Yigdal. Nosachari, the Sfard, it's not something that the Mekubalim are such a fan of. And the concept of the 13 principles of faith by the Mekubalim is never such a big deal. In the Rambam, in philosophy, it was a big deal. So where is it coming from? So things like this. The Rambam writes in Mor Nevuchim something very shocking, but it fits with his perspective of the world based on philosophy. The Rambam's opinion was as follows. He said that the truth is like this: the only way how a Jew could ever attain Olam Haba, to get, to have that level of attachment to Hashem, whatever Olam Haba means, as we talked about in the earlier shiurim, according to the Rambam, the Jew wants the ultimate attachment to Hashem, says the Rambam, can only be with the intellect. That's the way it is. If a person is born, says the Rambam, empty. Right? The brain of a baby it's all potential, but it doesn't really have anything in it. So after a person passes away, what continues on in the Rambam's perspective, and what has the ability of attaching oneself, and what does attach itself to the infinite light of Hashem, to the infinite mind of Hashem, is a person's mind. And therefore, the future of a person, the eternity of a person, what allows a person to continue on after death, in the perspective of the Rambam, it's all the intellect. And therefore, what the Rambam was doing by creating the 13 principles of faith with a tremendous chesed in his mind for Klal Yisrael, because the Rambam had the following problem. If it's true in the from the perspective of philosophy, that what gives a Jew eternity is the intellect, the development of his intellect, the truths, the godly truths that he develops with his mind, that he believes and he incorporates into his mind through years of learning. That's what lives on forever, and that's what attaches himself to God after death. Then what happens to all those people that aren't given the intellectual capabilities of learning and philosophizing and thinking about God and contemplating His truth and His oneness and His essence, all the complicated things that philosophy is based on, that Kabbalah is really about? What happens to all those Jews that don't have the time or don't have the intellectual capability of studying these things? So you're going to say that they're cut out from eternity, that they're not going to live on? So what the Rambam was doing by creating 13 principles of faith, what he was doing was the following thing. He was boiling down, he was giving us the basic knowledge that a Jew has to have to give him the ability of his intellect living on forever after death. That's what the Rambam was doing. And therefore, the Rambam wasn't going to be as meticulous in developing these 13 principles as he would be in other areas of halacha, not to repeat himself. Because the whole purpose of these 13 principles was to give the layman, someone who doesn't necessarily have the intellectual capabilities of thinking deeply and contemplating the truths of the universe, he was giving such a person just the basic things that he needs in order to live on and have a Olam Haba. That's what the Rambam was doing. And therefore, the opposite, because the purpose was to make it very clear and easy and basic for the average person. So the Rambam, even if one principle overlaps with the other, that's fine, because again, this is not something that the Rambam was doing, for the Talmidei Chachamim. He was doing this for the layman. He was doing this for the person that doesn't have the time or the intellectual capability of developing a philosophy and to develop his understanding of God, to give him just the basics of Yiddishkeit, to give him the basic truths of God himself in order that his intellect should be developed enough that he should be able to live on in Olam Haba. This is where the Rambam was coming from. So now this concept, because of this is where the Rambam was coming from in his development of the 13 principles of faith, I'm sure some of you already feel very strongly that the Mekubalim, this is very much against the entire concept of the Mekubalim, the perspective, the worldview of the Mekubalim. The Maharal, for example, I think he's one of the relatively earliest ones to speak out clearly against the Rambam in this perspective. The Maharal writes in a number of places against the whole concept that the Rambam says that the only way for a Jew to live on, to have Olam Haba, is through the development of his intellect. The Maharal, as all the Mekubalim agree, they all attack the Rambam on this point, and they say that it's completely incorrect. The thing that lives on, that gives a Jew the ability of living on and attaching oneself to Hashem, is not the intellect at all. It's the neshama. It's the neshama. It's the soul that's created, that's a piece of the divine presence, so to speak, whatever that means by the Mukubalim. It's the neshama that lives on. It's the neshama that gives a Jew the ability of connecting ultimately on the highest level to Hashem. And the intellect is not the thing that lasts. The opposite. The intellect dies away, and the purpose of the intellect is just to allow a person the ability of developing his neshama and allowing his neshama to express itself through mitzvahs and through learning and through davening and so on. But the essence of what a person is, and the essence that lasts forever, and the essence of the person that attaches oneself to Hashem in Olam Haba is the neshama. Now you have to understand, this is a very, very big gap between the two schools of philosophy and Kabbalah, a very, very big gap. That's why the Rambam, for example, writes in Mor Nevuchim that the purpose of all mitzvahs in the perspective of the Rambam is really three things. The Rambam boils down all of mitzvahs in Mor Nevuchim to three principles. First of all, to keep society functioning healthily, because you can't live if everyone's stealing from each other, everyone's killing each other. So that's one very practical reason for certain mitzvahs. That's a third of mitzvahs is for that reason. The other reason for the mitzvahs is to develop one's faith and to develop within a person intellectual truths. For example, we have Pesach. According to the Rambam, the reason for the Yontif of Pesach is to develop within the intellect of a Jew the truth and the knowledge that Hashem created the world, Hashem controls nature, and Hashem can do what He wants. That's the purpose of Pesach. And all mitzvahs like that, according to the Rambam, are for one thing. It's not the physical act of eating matzah that's important in itself. The purpose of eating matzah, for example, it's all about instilling within the person and developing one's intellect to have truth, to have true hashkafas, and to have true knowledge of as much as possible about Hashem Himself. Again, all to allowing the person to live on after death. Another reason for mitzvahs is to develop one's character traits. That's how the Rambam looks at Torah in general. It's not so much about the physical acts. It's more about what the physical acts do to the person's intellect and to the person's ability to function healthfully in society. That's how the Rambam looks. That's what the Rambam learned. All the Kabbalim violently disagree with that. That's not at all what Torah mitzvahs are about in the world, in the perspective of Kabbalah. I mentioned last time that that according to the Rizal, one of the basic reasons why Hashem created the world was to uplift sparks of holiness that have been scattered throughout the universe, in physical places and in physical matter. In the perspective of the Mukabalim, the purpose of mitzvahs are not to develop an intellect or to develop a sophisticated intellectual philosopher who is knowledgeable about the truths of Hashem and the truths of Torah. That's not the purpose of mitzvahs. The purpose of mitzvahs are to uplift the physical world through physical mitzvahs. You eat matzah, and the physical act of eating matzah somehow raises the sparks that are contained in those wheats, in that water, and so on. And all the effort that was put into making that matzah, and so on. According to the Mekubalan, physical mitzvahs are very, very important as far as the general philosophy of what the world is about. In the perspective of Rambam, it's not like that. So in other words, and again, this connects back to what we talked about earlier on, how by the Mekubalim, Olam Haba is body and soul together. And in the Rambam, it's not. It's the intellect floating out there in hyperspace without a body. And it's all coming from the same point, that in the world of philosophy, physical life is not given much importance. If anything, it's just a hindrance to spiritual life. But by the Mekubalim, it's the exact opposite. The purpose of creation was to uplift and to enhance and to infuse physical life with an unbelievable sense of spirituality. And that's where all Torah mitzvahs are coming from, and that's the purpose of all Torah mitzvahs. And therefore, this is a huge, huge gap. And that's why by the Mekubalim, like I said before, the 13 principles, everyone agrees to them. But as far as making Yiddishkeit into 13 principles, the Mekubalim they never saw a need for that, because it's only in the perspective of the Rambam and philosophy where what lives on and what's important, the essence of a person, is his intellect. That's when it's necessary. That's what is necessary to make 13 principles of faith. However, according to the Mekubalim and so on, the essence of Yiddishkeit is physically serving Hashem, showing and infusing physical life with kedusha through the physical acts that we have through Torah mitzvahs in a physical sense, and what lives on is that union of body and soul in a healthy way. It's not the intellect that lives on; it's the neshama that lives on, and ultimately the purpose of of everything is for that neshama to come back into the body and to infuse that body with its kedusha and to come together in the state of olam haba. So again, I figured it would be important to talk about this now because it really brings together everything we've been talking about. The whole perspective of Kabbalah as opposed to philosophy, very, very different. And I'm sure as you're feeling, Klal Yisrael has definitely chosen the path of the Kabbalah. There's no question that our hashkafas, our perspectives on life, our perspectives on Yiddishkeit, and on our relationship with Hashem is a Kabbalic relationship that we don't. The Jewish people have accepted the ways of Kabbalah as opposed to philosophy, and like I said, there's no Shulchan Aruch about this, but again, that's definitely the approach, the hashkafas Yisrael the Jewish people have accepted. So I guess with that, we'll open up to questions if there are any.
Is off.
Okay.
Josh just got another.
Questions? Go ahead.
Well, we have one problem that we just found out was
Hello?
that
Somebody's talking, but I don't hear the question. Hello? Anybody with a question? Yossi, maybe you can give us a practical difference between, let's say when it comes to Pesach, a practical approach difference between the Mekubalim and the Rambam. Is there something that comes to mind?
Well, when it comes to Pesach specifically, there's no question that in the perspective of the Rambam, the main purpose when a person's eating matzah, for example, a person's sitting down to eat matzah, to eat mar, and so on, in the perspective of the Rambam, what a person should be thinking about and developing in his mind are the intellectual truths that can be learned through the matzah. Matzah tells us, matzah symbolizes the whole Exodus, so a person should be thinking about this idea that Hashem controls nature and Hashem is one and so on and so forth. That's in the perspective of the Rambam. By the Mekubalim, there's no question that a person should be eating matzah. You should be thinking about these things. There's no question. But by the Mekubalim, the matzah itself, just eating matzah and just having the simple thought in mind that I'm doing this because Hashem told me to, that itself does a lot more, according to the Mekubalim, than having all the philosophical debates and analysis that a person can theoretically have. By the Zohar Kadosh, matzah is called mechla d'meimnusa, a food that of faith, and mechla d'misavusa, and a food that brings healing. It's the food itself that somehow Hashem infused in that piece of physicality called matzah, this ability of some level of kedusha. When a person consumes that and brings it into his mind, and brings it into his body, with thinking the simple thought of, I'm doing this because Hashem told me to, that does a lot more than his intellect. I'll give you an example. If a person, but according to the Mekubalim, from the perspective of the Mekubalim, if a person connects to Hashem only through the intellect, that can be compared to a prince. This is a mashal that the Storm bring down. A prince who, the king, for example, opens the palace gates, opens the palace doors. Everyone's allowed in to make a request and to have a front with the king, to have a conversation with the king, and so on. So all the ministers, all the civilians, all the regular people make a line, and they're all waiting for their turn. And lo and behold, the prince also is the same thing. The prince just sitting on line with everyone else. So one of the ministers finally goes over to the prince and says, I understand what you're doing. We have no shaykh. We're not really related to the king. We're not coming from the king himself. So we have no choice but to wait online and to have a conversation face to face and to express our thoughts to the king himself. But you're the son. And as the son of the king, you don't have to wait online like all of us. You go up to the king, you give him a hug, and the king knows what you want. And the king will take care of you on his own. The Kabbalah explained that a Jewish person, what Pesach has to tell a person is that our relationship to Hashem is not through the intellect and not a cold, distant one, where the only way how we can confront Hashem is through analysis and intellectualism and so on. We're Hashem's princes, we're Hashem's sons. And all we have to do is just release that part of ourselves and express that part of ourselves, and everything else falls to the wayside. So what matzah does, what a person should be thinking, what I personally think, a person should be thinking when a person is eating matzah, drinking the cups of wine and so on, is just a simple thought that we are sons of Hashem. We are princes of Hashem, and we are part of Hashem, that we have the neshama, we have the divine presence within us. And by eating matzah, by eating mar, by drinking the 4 cups of wine, by talking about the Yetzias Mitzrayim and reading the Haggadah and so on, what our kavanah should be is to fulfill the mitzvahs of Hashem and to allow and to somehow through these actions, through these physical actions, allow that part of ourselves to finally express itself, and not to be overshadowed by the intellect. Just that part of ourselves which is simple, which is honest, which is attached to Hashem in the deepest levels, to allow that to express itself. And once that does, all the questions go away. You don't necessarily have the answers to the questions, but they stop bothering you to the sense of where you have a hard time davening. You know what I mean, all those questions go away, and a person begins to become to sort of heal oneself spiritually from all the difficulties, from all the philosophical problems that have plagued him throughout the years. That's why matzah is a food of faith. It's a food of faith, and it's a food of healing. Because what matzah is, what it brings out, the potential of matzah is to bring out within a Jew that simple, honest to goodness truth that's contained within his soul, which is that we are a chelik l'kamimal, we are a piece of divine presence, and we are Hashem Himself. And our connection to Hashem is beyond, much deeper and much more beyond the intellect. It's a soul relationship. And that relationship brings healing, and it brings comfort, and it brings the ability of a Jew to overcome all the difficult problems that they might have intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually that has plagued the person over the years. So we should be zeichet very soon to have that day. That when we come to Pesach, I think, to be honest with you, I think that's the simplest and the best kavanah to have. Just eat the matzah l'shem shemayim, and the matzah should somehow do its thing. To do its thing, not necessarily to enlighten us, intellectually, but to do its thing spiritually, and to allow and to give a health to the neshama, to allow the neshama to express itself in a healthy, vibrant way. So it's a very good question, and the truth is, Reb Tzadok writes about this in a number of places. He says that the essence, there's no question that Kabbalah. I don't mean to oversimplify. Kabbalah is very, very complicated. The system of the Arizal is extremely complicated, and it's very interconnected, and it makes a person sweat. It's very, very difficult. But Reb Tzadok does say that all the yichudim, all the unifications, all the divine names that a person that's on the level could be and should be thinking about by davening and so on, Rav Tzadok says all of that is all really just a manifestation of one truth, which is that it's all God, that everything is coming from Hashem and everything eventually leads to Hashem. And that's all these unifications, all these kavanas, Rav Tzadok says that's the essence of what they're about. The kavanah, thinking about Hashem's name and how they interact with each other. If it remains, if a person is doing that just on the intellectual level, then it's not going to get anywhere. That's not the purpose of what these kavanas are about. The purpose of these kavanas are, when a person thinks about the names of Hashem and so on, the purpose of those thoughts is to get to that point of where a person sees the whole world as names of Hashem. And that might sound very much out there, but that's exactly what it's about. It's about seeing the world in a different way. It's about seeing the world through a spiritual perspective and recognizing how all physical life are just a manifestation of spirituality, it's symbolized with the divine names of Hashem. But that's what it's about. So all the yichudim, all the unifications of Kabbalah, as complicated as they might be, they do all come down to this one simple truth, which is that everything is godliness and everything has to be infused with spirituality. That's not a simple thing to do, because it's not just an intellectual thing to believe. It has to be something that the Mekubal sees with his eyes and feels with his heart. It takes years and years and years of spiritual growth to get to that point. But that's what all the kavanas of the Arizal, it's all about that one point. And that's what the Baal Shem Tov in his generation taught, that for those that are not on the level of thinking divine names and all the complicated kavanas of the Arizal, the Baal Shem Tov did teach that the simplest and the most basic and the most important kavanah by davening and by any mitzvah is to think this idea on one's own level, to recognize and to believe and to instill in oneself that everything that he's going through in life, all the physical ups and downs and all the challenges that a person faces and everything mitzvah that a person does, it's all elikos, it's all godliness, just enclosed in the physical world. And that's what it's all about. So as the Baal Shem Tov said, all the kavanas of the Arizal are just keys to get to that one room called simple faith. And that's what it's about. So you're right, Kabbalah is very complicated and it's very esoteric and it's very, 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 very intellectually difficult and stimulating. But the purpose of it all is get to that one truth for the person to really see and to feel this world as just a reflection of the spiritual world, and that's something that all Kabbalah is the purpose of it is to get to. And it's unfortunate if a person learns Kabbalah and it only remains intellectual. That's not the purpose of it at all. But I don't mean to give off the impression that Kabbalah is simplistic. It's not at all. It's very, very complicated. But the point is, with all the complications of Kabbalah, it's all there to bring a person to that place called simple faith. That place called looking at the world with spiritual eyes. I hope that clarifies a little bit.
Okay, shkoyach. If anybody has any last questions, speak now, please. No. Okay. So shkoyach Yossi, and the mitzvah in the next 2 weeks. Obviously, there'll be no shir. We'll pick it up again after Pesach. Mitzvah Shem.
Chag kosher v'sameach. Everyone have a good Pesach.